In this video, we're going to cover the EC2 container register, which is this part of the overall architecture. This is basically where we're going to upload our code so that ECS can grab a fully functioning application and drop it into a server that it scales for us. So to start, we have our Laravel example app. We have the CDK we initialized in the previous video, and I've just gone ahead and added a Docker directory into the root of this application. Now, I'm not going to cover Docker in detail because it's going to vary depending on the language and framework you use. So Docker is assumed knowledge for this course. If for whatever reason you are not comfortable with Docker, just Google Docker tutorials for the specific language and framework you are using, and you will find plenty of free resources. So this is a PHP application, so the main application is going to be served via Apache. The only thing I really need to cover here that's going to be kind of common across all your Docker files, regardless of what language or framework you use, is this environment variable here, the AWS container credentials relative URI. Basically, the ECS container agent sets this when your task starts, and it's exposed to the main process that has the process ID of 1. So if your program isn't running on process ID 1, it won't be able to see this environment variable, and your container won't actually be able to access any of the AWS SDKs, because it basically uses this to access the roles credentials. So we'll cover task roles in a later video, but basically you define a role and a set of permissions for each task that specifies how your container is run. That task and that container has an IAM role, and that role has permissions, and it basically grabs those credentials from this relative URI, which the agent sets in process 1. So you're going to have to potentially export this to be able to be accessed from whatever is your main process for your container. So for Apache, that's this. For the scheduler, I'm running a cron tab. So to pass that environment variable to the cron tab environment, it just is in etc environment. And so you need to figure out exactly what process your container is going to be using and where it accesses its environment variables from, and you're going to need to pass this environment variable there. Otherwise, you're going to get permissions issues later down the road. But other than that, it's just straightforward Docker. That's all you need to know for ECS. So let's jump into our CDK and into our library. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, this is purely just a matter of taste, is I really don't like those star imports. So I'm going to get rid of these CDK dots in front of all of these. We shouldn't have any namespace conflicts here. And I'm just going to import these as destructured dependencies. And that's just a pure style thing, but it is one thing I'll do differently than the CDK documentation if you're following along at home, and it's just purely a style thing. So that's why my code might be different than other code examples you see. So the first thing we need to do is set up an IAM user that is going to be able to upload our code to the ECR, and in order to do that, we're going to need to install some dependencies. So we're going to change into our CDK directory because we're going to install a few npm packages for the CDK. CDK splits all its different constructs up into different libraries to keep the package size small. So every time you need to interact with a different resource, you generally need to install the CDK library that's associated with it. So we're going to need 3 here. We can just import them as normal dependencies because none of this code gets deployed anyway. It's all just run from your deployment pipeline. So we're going to need IAM, we're going to need ECR assets, and we're also going to need just ECR. So let's go install those 3 dependencies. Cool. And now we can start here. So this is not going to be a deep dive into CDK or a best practice guide for CDK. We're just going to do the bare minimum to spin up the architecture in our example. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create a user. Using this user construct, we're going to pass this in. The second argument is always the name, so let's call this deployment user. And then the third parameter is always the set of properties for the construct. So we don't need any in this case. We're going to import this IAM user. Now that we have this user, the next thing we're going to want to do is basically grant this user read permissions to the ECR. And now we just need to basically tell the CDK how to create our images. So if we look at our architecture diagram, we basically have 3 images in the ECR. We have an image for our application, which serves our main application code. We have an image that is for background jobs, and background jobs are basically processing our SQS queue. And then we have a scheduler image, which is basically just the image that runs our scheduled jobs via the cron tab. So we're going to basically create 3 different image constructs here. So the application image is going to be the first one. This is going to be a new Docker image asset. Pass this as the first parameter as always, and name is going to be application image, and then the properties. So this construct takes 2 properties. The first one is the directory, and we're just going to go back to the root directory, so one directory up, and then the file is going to be, we had this in a folder called Docker, and then the application one was in Apache directory, and then it was just called Docker file. And that's really all we need to tell the CDK where to grab the Docker file, basically the information to create our image asset, and then CDK will upload this to ECR for us. And that's really all there is. So CDK is really powerful. It's very, very concise, easy to work with. It's TypeScript, so we have good validation on the props and good autocomplete and all of that. So let's actually just go create the scheduler one and the queue worker one while we're here. Let me just validate that. So we have our Docker, Apache, queue worker, scheduler, cool. So it's basically just going to grab these Docker files. If I grab the main one for the application, and yeah, it's going to build our assets from that. And that's all we need to do for now. So I can run CDK synth here. And CDK synth is basically going to take our CDK code and generate some CloudFormation for us, because that is all CDK does. What you're going to get after a fairly long amount of time has passed is this error saying ename too long, name too long, and then a big stack trace, and it's going to exit. So the reason for this is because the way we set up our project structure, where CDK is a sub-resource of the root directory, basically when we're building our Docker images, it's going to copy the CDK into the image, and we're going to create this recursive loop. So what we need to do is, if you don't have a Docker ignore file, you need to create one. If you do have one, you're going to need to open that up. You're going to want to open that up, and you're basically going to want to add CDK to that. And then it just turns that into CloudFormation for us. So after we run synth, we will notice we now have a CDK out directory. If we go to CDK out, CDK out template, we'll basically see this has generated CloudFormation for us. And in order to deploy this, we just need to make sure that we have our AWS profile set. So I just have a AWS account that I've called Playground Admin. I have my credentials set on my local machine, and we can just run CDK deploy. And it will generally give you a warning. Anytime you do anything with permissions, it'll basically give you a list of all the IAM statement changes, just so you don't accidentally push a change that'll impact your security. And if that looks all good, you just tell it yes. This is going to fail because we haven't actually bootstrapped a new CDK project yet. So CDK actually requires some resources in your account for it to work. So we need to run CDK bootstrap. You might not be able to see with this contrast, but the error message basically just tells that run CDK bootstrap to initialize the resources you need in your account. So let's run that. This is going to create some base resources for us, and you can see this CDK CLI is actually pretty nice. It tells us exactly the resources that are being created. It will just take a few minutes to run. Great. And now we can run CDK deploy. Now that it has bootstrapped that environment for us. Yes, I want to deploy these changes. And this is going to go ahead and build the Docker images from our Docker file and upload them to ECR. This is going to take a while. So once it's gone and built those images and pushed them up, it's going to update the CloudFormation stack. While that's updating, we can see here inside the Elastic Container Registry, for Amazon ECR, we have those 3 images uploaded. You'll notice a slight size difference. So one of these is going to be the scheduled jobs, slightly bigger. The others, the queue processor and the application image, are exactly the same image for now. So they should be the same size with their image tags. So we haven't looked at custom tagging or anything. We're just covering the basics of pushing them up. So you'll notice these under CDK assets in your container registry. And yeah, you'll see those here now. So let's go back. CDK stack is now updated.